So most of our customers, when they come to us, they want to talk about, sort of how to create an environment where they get sort of an end-to-end view of the security posture of their entire process, right? So they come to us and they say, okay, I've got a process in place, whether that be using Spinnaker or Argo or Jenkins or whatever the case might be, right? And for
Mhm.
us, it doesn't really matter, right? Whatever that customer process is, we've sort of modeled our product to come to you, right, in terms of what you're doing. And so what we do is we'll come in and we'll actually integrate with any of the tooling that you're using. Now, if for some reason there's gaps in your tooling, we actually have integrated with a lot of the more potent open source tools. So as an example, we may run across a customer who says, I don't have a SAST and DAS tool or static code analysis tool yet. Great. We actually ship with one that you can use. Or if you're already using one, we can sort of integrate with that as well. But the idea behind this is that each step along the way here, right, we're helping you gather the information or actually doing the scans or ingesting the security information. So as an example, the very first thing that we can integrate with is your source code control, right? And so we're going to start to analyze how you're managing source code control. So for example, are you following best practices as it relates to SSF benchmarks in terms of how you're managing your source code? Then we're moving on to things like the build system. And we're looking at, is your Jenkins running the most secure version? Are the webhooks that are being utilized, are they secure? Ultimately, looking at things when we look at build, like the artifacts that are coming out of the build server, let's make note of, are they signed? Or if they're not signed, let's grab an identifier like a SHA so that we can make sure as we move across to the deploy that what came out of your build system is actually what ends up getting deployed. We do the same thing with things like vulnerabilities, right? So if you've got artifacts there and you're using, say, a vulnerability management system, we'll go ahead and actually ingest the SBOM and then better understand. Now, if you're not using a system, we ship with one, right? That allows us to go ahead and actually look at the source code composition or the packages that are being brought in, and then ultimately give you an assessment of the security of that particular package that was built. It's the same thing with artifacts. So if you're bringing in third-party artifacts, we can actually break those artifacts down, create an SBOM for you, and then ultimately give you a security posture based on that as well. And then lastly, depending on how you're deploying, we're going to ultimately then go through the process of analyzing the deployment scheme, right? So what type of, where is this being deployed? What type of rules are in place? Or if there aren't any, how do we enforce the rules to make sure that the deployment is indeed safe? So not only is the software safe, but the actual deployment itself is also safe. And so this is really where we're giving you sort of that end-to-end view. And really, we're looking at very holistically that piece from sort of the initial developer check-in all the way through to the deployment. And then even post-deployment, and again, depending on sort of how you're deploying and sort of where you're deploying to, we can do things like monitor for drift. So even in a post-deployment world where a customer may say, hey, I've deployed, but then, during operation runtime, an operator has had to go in there and make a change. Or as an example, if an open source package that you're using suddenly announces a 0-day vulnerability, we have a plan in place to be able to go off and ultimately identify those vulnerabilities for you. But more importantly, show you exactly where those things are, like where are the impacted pieces for that vulnerability. And essentially what we're doing here is we're setting up a series of guardrails for your deployment process and making sure that we're enforcing those rules. You mentioned, and let me go ahead and actually build this out. So you mentioned earlier talking a little bit about some of the pieces that you want to put in place to make sure that you're meeting the standards that your customers expect. So whether it be things like SOC 2 Type 2 or HIPAA, PCI, FedRAMP, ISO 27001. One of the things that we're also doing here is we are setting up that rule set to allow you to go ahead and to allow us to go ahead and analyze that software delivery process, not just the artifacts. I mean, anyone can scan artifacts and say, hey, here are the vulnerabilities, but we're taking a very holistic view of, what does the source code management look like? What does the build system look like? What does, if you're leveraging things like infrastructure as code, like Terraform or some other piece to go ahead and actually adjust infrastructure out in front of you deployment? Are those rules being followed, right? So all of these things add up to our ability to monitor and analyze, and then ultimately in real time enforce a set of guardrails. And ultimately, some of our customers choose to run our system in sort of more of an audit mode, where they're simply just monitoring and getting alerts when there are problems. Some of our customers are actually looking to run us in enforcement mode, where if we find something that they consider critical, we'll go ahead and actually block a deployment until that issue is resolved, right? So really, and doing all this in an automated fashion, right? So that you don't wind up in a situation where you're stopping something, looking at it, making a decision. The system is ultimately making the decision for you. Now, on the flip side of that, and we'll talk about this a little bit more in the demo, what we're doing, because we are essentially creating a data warehouse of all of your CI/CD data, we're also generating what we call a delivery bill of materials. So basically what we can do is we can provide audit reporting and real-time insights into sort of what's happening with a deployment and where the problems are, right? Or when a deployment is clean and finally reaches the production state, we actually freeze that report and now ultimately have a record that these are all the checks that were made. These are all the exceptions that were taken. So that ultimately you have a report, if an auditor walks through the door, that you can say, here's our SDLC, and here's how we're enforcing that SDLC. Or here's all the rules that are associated with HIPAA and PCI, and here's an engine that's sitting in the middle of our deployment process, and then here's the data that it's gathering to ensure that we're in compliance. So those are the things, guys, that we are doing to help ensure that sort of end-to-end piece. Now, I think Shashank had also mentioned, some of our customers come to us looking for, sort of the wider solution. So we can also provide that ability to go ahead and actually start doing deployments through a workflow platform as well. So whether you're deploying to, say, Kubernetes exclusively, and you want to use something like Argo, or if you're using sort of more of a multifaceted deployment strategy, you can use something like Spinnaker. But either way, we're able to sort of tap into all of that data and ultimately show you that end-to-end picture. And I think what I want to do is I want to show you a little bit more about that sort of in product. But let me stop there for a moment. Does all this make sense so far?